Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're venturing into a really fascinating corner of the Old Testament, maybe a bit unexpected for some. We're going to zero in on a specific passage, Numbers chapter 30, verses 1 through 16.
Right. In this passage, it really gives us a window into how ancient Israelite society thought about commitments, promises made to God specifically, and particularly how family relationships, played into that.
Exactly. It raises some pretty interesting questions about responsibility, authority back then. So our goal today really is to untack the nuances here. These ancient rules, what do they tell us about the social scene, the religious landscape, and maybe how can we connect these regulations that seem maybe distant to bigger ideas about promises, responsibility, things that might still resonate. We're kind of hunting for those details that, surprise you or shed some light.
And it's worth pointing out, the source material we have, it isn't just a dry list of rules. It gives us direct instructions from the Lord given through Moses. And then there's a short interpretation added, which emphasizes a particular view, a view of family order as, divinely set up, meant for protection, for honor within those family structures.
Okay, let's dig into this then. Let's start with the men. Verse 2. It seems to lay down a pretty clear baseline principle for men making vows to the Lord. What's the gist there?
Well, verse 2 is quite direct. It says, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So it sets up this really strong sense of personal obligation for men.
No wiggle room there.
Not really, no. It suggests that, in that culture, a man's word, especially one given to God, it carried immense weight. It was expected to be absolutely binding. This whole emphasis on keeping vows, especially for men, it points to a culture where, honor, reliability, these were fundamental for society to function. Even religious promises were tied up with your standing in the community.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, now, here's where it gets maybe a bit more complex. Let's get into the rules for women, starting with young women. Still living under their father's authority, that's verses 3 through 5. What's the setup?
Okay, so the scenario is this. A young woman, she's living in her father's house, and she makes a vow, or maybe a pledge. The key thing, the absolute pivot point, is how her father reacts when he hears about it.
Okay.
If he hears the vow, and he stays silent, says nothing. The text is specific. All her vows shall stand, and every pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand.
So silence equals consent, basically.
In effect, yes. His silence is taken as approval.
But what if he doesn't stay silent? What if he objects?
Right. So if the father opposes her vow, and crucially, on the very day he hears about it, then no vow of hers, no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. And it adds, and the Lord will forgive her because her father opposed her.
Wow. So the father has significant power there.
It certainly places a significant level of authority with the father.
Yeah.
Specifically regarding his daughter's religious commitments made while she's under his roof, under his care.
That power dynamic seems, pretty stark. How have people typically understood this? I mean, is it just about control, or are there other ways to look at it?
That's a really important question. The interpretation provided in our source material offers one view. It suggests this responsibility given to fathers isn't necessarily about, say, domination, but maybe more about protection, honor.
Yeah.
Like within that specific family setup, it presents this idea of a divine design where love and responsibility are, meant to work together. And that provision for forgiveness when the father steps in. You could see that as maybe protecting the daughter from promises she couldn't keep, perhaps, or ones the father thought weren't wise for her.
That's definitely a different angle. Okay, let's shift gears now. Married women. That's verses 6 through 15. This seems to add another layer, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The text tackles situations where a woman might have made a vow before she got married and then marries. Or maybe she makes a vow during her marriage. And similar to the father's role we just discussed, the husband's immediate reaction, right when he hears the vow, that's critical.
Okay, so if he hears it and says nothing.
If he hears the vow and stays silent on the day he hears it, then the vow stands. It's binding on her.
So that immediate reaction is the consistent theme here. Silence means go ahead. But what if the husband does speak up? If he opposes it?
Well, if the husband opposes the vow on the day he hears it, he has the authority to nullify it, to make it void. And just like with the father's opposition, the text says, the Lord will forgive her.
Okay, so a parallel structure there. Father for the unmarried daughter, husband for the wife.
Pretty much, yeah. At least concerning these specific religious commitments.
Now, verse 13 gets specific about vows of self-affliction. What were those? typically. And were they handled any differently?
Right. Vows of self-affliction, that could involve things like fasting, maybe other kinds of personal denial, acts of piety, basically. And yes, verse 13 is very clear. Any vow and any binding oath to afflict herself, her husband may establish, or her husband may make void.
So that really emphasizes the husband's authority,
Yeah.
especially in things that could directly affect his wife's well-being or maybe even just the household routine.
Exactly. It underscores his role in those matters.
But then, verse 9, there's a big exception mentioned there. Widows and divorced women. Why the difference?
Yes, verse 9. It states that any vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, anything by which she has bound herself, shall stand against her. This is a huge shift in responsibility.
It really is.
Once a woman isn't under the authority of a father or husband, at least in this particular social and legal framework, she takes on full personal responsibility for her own vows to God.
That distinction really throws those familial authority structures into sharp relief, doesn't it? And then there's verse 15. It adds a twist. A consequence for the husband if he waits too long to object. That's interesting.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Verse 15 says, but if he makes them null and void after he has heard of them, then he shall bear her iniquity. So this implies the husband has to act promptly.
Right. Can't just sit on it.
Exactly. If he hears the vow, stays silent initially, essentially letting it stand, he can't just change his mind later without some consequence. If he voids it late, he basically takes on the liability, the iniquity, for her vow not being fulfilled.
That's quite something. It really makes you think about how differently they viewed these commitments compared to, say, today, where individual autonomy is such a core value.
It's a very different framework.
And we keep seeing that phrase on the day that he hears of it. Why the urgency? Why that specific timing? What might have been the practical reason for that?
Well, the emphasis on the immediate response probably highlights how important clear, prompt communication was seen to be within the family regarding these serious commitments. It would cut down on ambiguity, right? Prevent confusion or later arguments about whether a vow was valid or needed fulfilling. It suggests a system where these religious promises needed sorting out quickly, no delays.
Okay, so let's circle back to that interpretive note you mentioned earlier, the one in our source. It frames all this as God setting up a family order. Not to diminish women, it says, but to protect and honor them. Now, given what seems like limitations on a woman's independent action with vows, how might the text itself lend support to that kind of protective interpretation?
Well, the interpretation leans heavily on this idea of entrusted responsibility. By giving fathers and husbands this authority, the source suggests it's a form of, maybe, care, oversight,
Right.
within the accepted social norms of that time. And that point about divine forgiveness, when a father or husband steps in, that could be seen as a safety net. Protection against, say, impulsive promises, or vows that might be too burdensome for the woman under their care.
I see.
The underlying idea presented is harmony in the family, based on love, yes, but also on responsibility. And what they saw as appropriate freedom within that specific structure, that's framed as the intended goal.
Okay, right. So let's try to pull together some key insights here. What are the main takeaways we should hold on to from this deep dive into Numbers 30?
Okay, first point. For men, keeping their word to the Lord was absolutely crucial, foundational. Second, for unmarried women at home, their vows were conditional, subject to their father's okay when he heard about them.
Right.
Third, for married women, similarly, their vows depended on their husband's approval on the day he found out. Fourth takeaway, the text definitely shows a hierarchical family structure with specific roles, specific responsibilities when it came to these religious commitments. Fifth, that mention of divine forgiveness when a father or husband cancels a vow suggests that God is ultimately in charge, even within these human authority systems.
And last one.
And finally, sixth, the different treatment of widows and divorced women. It really highlights their direct responsibility for their own vows once they're outside that immediate male authority structure defined here.
Got it. And what about some of the maybe bigger questions or nuances this brings up, things we should keep mulling over?
Yeah, I think a key area is just the broader context, the culture of the society of ancient Israel. Why this setup? What were the prevailing norms about family, about authority, about women's roles that might help explain these specific rules? And also, how does this view of vows and authority fit into the bigger picture of family and individual responsibility in the Old Testament generally?
Important questions. And of course, interpretations of these roles, these responsibilities, they've changed hugely over time, vary across cultures. But our focus here is just understanding the text itself and that specific interpretation provided in our source.
Exactly. We're just reporting on what the source says.
All right, so we've taken a pretty thorough deep dive into this section of Numbers. As we wrap this up, we've looked at the specific rules for vows, seen how responsibilities differed based on gender, based on family status, and we've also touched on that interpretation emphasizing a divinely ordered family structure intended in its historical context for protection and honor.
Right. And considering this ancient framework, it really prompts you to think, doesn't it, about the fundamental nature of making commitments. In any relationship, really, even today. What might it suggest about authority dynamics? Or that balance which can be tricky between what an individual intends and the responsibilities we have within our families, our communities, even in our very different world now.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah. How might looking at a historical view like this challenge, or maybe even affirm some of your own views on these basic aspects of how we relate to each other?
Some really thought-provoking points to leave you with. If this deep dive into Numbers 30 has piqued your interest, we definitely encourage you. Go look at other Old Testament passages, ones that talk about family structure, individual duties. You might uncover even more fascinating details, more complexities to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.